That Vegemite really stands out on the screen when you record it. It's really amazing.
I don't get commission or anything. There's no sponsorship.
I'll bet. I don't think Australia owns it anymore.
They know it's back in Australia.
Oh, is it? Oh,
Yeah, it's not craft anymore. It's some other. It's an Australian company.
I might kick off just with our intro, with our housekeeping before we go. I'll just use my voice so that I can open up your phones. Hello, just grab. This one's the one I'm on, but yeah, great. We've just got a few people arriving. We'll just find a last couple of seats. So excellent. Thank you. Great. Thanks, everybody. It's lovely to see you all here tonight and so close to Easter. So thank you for coming. Just a couple of bits of housekeeping before we actually kick off. One of them is that there are toilets which are just through that gate, and in the corner you'll see a lit up cubicle, and that's where the toilets are. So feel free to use those. Also, the book is front and center at the counter. So after the event, we'll go to a signing and we'll take Jason inside next to the front door. And that way we can mingle and be in aircon and purchase his book if you'd like to and get him to sign it. So after the event, we'll get Jason out there to do that. If you have your phones with you, if you can switch them to silent, that'd be great. And anyone, I'd also like to welcome the Zoom people. You don't have to switch anything to silent. You can play your music as loud as you like. But for the Zoom people, the housekeeping is that we're going to put a little link to the book now in the chat function, and that chat function is where you can ask questions at any time throughout the event, and I'll be able to then pass those questions on to Jason at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet in this area, the Yagara and the Turrbal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any other elders who are with us tonight, or First Nations people. We are going out onto the lands of many different Aboriginal people across Australia because of the Zoom element of tonight, and I pay my respects to elders all over this country on whatever lands you may be joining us from. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and sovereignty was never ceded. So tonight it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Peter Mccutcheon, who is a Brisbane-based journalist, broadcaster and senior reporter with ABC's 7:30 program. Peter is also a former Tokyo-based foreign correspondent and executive producer of the Landline program. In a media career spanning 35 years, he has been based in Sydney, Darwin and Melbourne, where he was the ABC's national industrial correspondent. Outside of the ABC, Peter has worked as a media advisor to the University of Queensland. Please welcome Peter Mccutcheon. And to my left, we have Jason Om, who is a Walkley Award-winning reporter with ABC's 7:30 program. Previously, he's been a presenter on the ABC News Channel and a reporter for ABC News Breakfast, ABC Life, Lateline and ABC Radio. In 2017, he won widespread praise for his personal story about his dad's 16-year struggle to accept him as gay. The article and TV piece ran Australia-wide, attracting 1 million views. Viewers were moved to tears, and the story earned Jason a nomination in the 2018 New South Wales LGBTI Honours Award. All Mixed Up is his first book. Welcome, Jason Om.
Hello. Now, Jason and I are work colleagues, and a few weeks ago we made he made a joke about not wanting any difficult questions because he's not very good at interviews. Then when I read the book, you talked about not being good at interviews. In fact, he failed an interview trying to get into journalism school at RMIT. So, and that's because you forgot to prepare for an obvious question.
Yeah, it was a really basic question, and that was, why do you want to be a journalist?
So I thought I'd start up tonight with a really obvious question to see if you've learned anything.
Why do you want to be a journalist? Well,
No.
that's a boring question.
You're barely 40 years old, Jason. You've written a memoir. Why do you want to write a memoir? So young.
Why? Well, there were a few motivations. I mean, this memoir, why I wrote this memoir is actually deeply, deeply personal. I mean, some of you might know the story about my dad and his 16-year struggle with my sexuality, which exploded on national TV in 2017 during the same-sex marriage debate. But this story is actually about the events prior to that and the events after it. It's actually about my life. So I go back to my childhood in the 1980s, growing up in the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne, my teenhood after mum died in the 1990s. And I take you to all lots of different places. So it's a real family odyssey. I take you to sultry Malaysia, where my Catholic Eurasian mother was born, and where my Muslim half-sister was born and also lives. And I also take you to Cambodia, where my dad was born in the northwest. But you know about the dad story, but let me tell you about the mum story, which is even more phenomenal. And that's the reason why I started this memoir, because I started writing this back in 2014, 2015. And, when I was 12 years old, mum died. I called the ambulance and I had to do CPR on her. But I put up an emotional wall to protect myself, a barricade against that. And it was only in my adulthood when I started to confront the past and look back. So it was 2013. That was the 20th anniversary of mum's death. And in the same year, my grandmother fell ill and she died the same year. And that brought back all of the feelings that I had suppressed and held up behind the wall. It all sort of came crashing through. And I realized that I had to confront my past. And that's what set me off on the journey to start the writing, to discover what happened to her, or who was she, and what the hell happened to her. Because and we will unpack this, I'm sure, but I had a very complicated relationship with my mother.
Yes, so when I first approached the book, I was expecting an expansion of the essay or the article, but it's not that at all. In fact, it's quite surprising. There's many layers to it. But when you come out to your dad when you're in your early 20s, it's almost like an anticlimax, isn't it?
Well, because I had a very strong sense of identity. I knew it here that I was gay. And it took a long time because, as a teenager, you're trying to work yourself out. And I'd go on these hopeless dates with girls. And I thought I liked girls, but really deep down, I had feelings for guys. But, and once I sort of overcame that denial, I was very clear about it. I knew for sure that was what the evidence was pointing to, it was the, dirty late night movies on SBS. And it was, a particular boy in my year who I had a massive crush on as well. And I know, and so you're trying to work yourself out, and I knew that. So by the time I came out to Dad, because I'd come out to my one of my best friends in uni, first off, I was 18 years old, and then I came out to Dad a couple of years later when I was 20, and I knew, so when I told him, when I was living in a share house in North Melbourne, I just point blank said to him, look, I'm gay, this is who I am, it's not a phase. And he sort of said, but we sent you to Catholic school. and he sort of gripped the chair, kind of not, but we sent you to Catholic school. And I said, yeah, you did. And quietly I thought maybe that was the problem, because it wasn't all boys school.
Yeah. What I found interesting is that article that I think everyone would be aware of before they, even if you haven't read the book, it comes at the end. And after you've dealt with the issues involving your mum, which we'll get onto in a sec. But it's interesting at the end because it becomes a way of you knowing more about your dad and your dad knowing more about you.
Yeah.
And it's the same-sex marriage plebiscite that brought that on. Now, I know for a lot of people, going to a plebiscite was deeply problematic. It invited vilification, it created division, but in your experience, it created an opportunity for you as well.
Yeah, look, we can't underestimate the amount of stress that process caused our community. It was a lot of stress, but it forced me and my dad to have the conversation. In effect, it forced a lot of families in Australia who were grappling with this to talk about it at the kitchen table, and not necessarily, but it did put it at the forefront of people's minds because it was on the bloody news all the time. It was the lead story, and I thought about Dad and how he would sit there reading the news, sometimes with me presenting. I'm presenting. I was a presenter for the news channel, and I'm sitting there presenting stories about the same-sex marriage debate and reading it to him as he's sitting at home, in the lounge room. And I'm thinking, he's being, bombarded by all these negative stories, and what is he thinking? And I at that point, because prior to that, in early 2016, I got the bombshell phone call from my dad, where I was at work. He called me up. He very rarely calls me because he doesn't, our relationship was quite strained at that time. And he's ringing me up and he's saying, I'm getting old now. Would you take a wife? And that completely blindsided me because, again, as I say, I'd come out to him in, my 20s. This was 15 years ago. And now he's saying, can you marry a woman? And he was he had a particular woman in mind, and he also was going to ask for me, to set it up. And as I say, I was blindsided because I had been striding through life confident in my sexuality, confident in who I was. Everybody knew, my friends knew, my colleagues knew, the public knew because I was on Twitter and it was, it was all out there. But for him, it showed me that he hadn't fully addressed it. And then, and in the book I do go through, because there's actually another event that happened Christmas 2016 as well, which is in the book. But it gives you context, because I think that if readers know that story, the online article, when you read it again, it has even more power in it because you see the struggle that me and my dad went through, not just on that issue, but also the grief of losing mum when I was 12. But this is not really a coming out story. It is actually a coming to story. It's actually my dad coming to accept me for who I am, because I was okay. I was already like, whatever, but it was him like he couldn't quite grasp. And the thing is that my dad's very traditional. He's Cambodian, and his view is that, well, a life is you have kids and then your kids go on to have children, and that's the cycle. That's the cycle of life. It continues. It's a bit patriarchal because it continues the family name, okay? But, so I can understand that he was disappointed in that sense, that perhaps, it's not mutually exclusive, but perhaps that he wouldn't see me have grandchildren. Because he got very jealous of seeing my auntie kind of always show off photos of her grandchildren and bragging about them. And so for him, I'm his only child, and I'm his only son. So the pressure on me, to carry on the family name is there. It's implicit. It's not explicit. It's not saying that I have to. But that was a revelation in 2017. Yeah.
Now, a unifying person in your whole memoir is your mum, which is ironic because she had such a traumatic life full of division and separation. She was separated from her family, separated from her first husband, separated from her daughter. Yet she is the force that brought you and your sister, your half-sister in Malaysia together, and it's the most unlikely friendship on one way. She's devout Muslim, but you know, it's a lovely moment in the book. But when you first went ahead with what you call this investigation, did you really think that was going to be the end? Did you have an end in sight, or were you worried you were going to find too many skeletons in your family closet?
So just to give you context, I actually turned the blowtorch on my family, on a very low level here though, because there were a lot of questions about Mum. You know, she would always talk about Mum had a nervous breakdown, and Dad would also talk about that as well. But what does nervous breakdown mean? You know, it's a euphemism. And I was always, you know, because I knew Mum as this broken woman, and she was always full of sorrow, and I didn't know why. And that created a gulf between me and her, because she while she could be, you know, touchy-feely and, you know, full of hugs and kisses, she could also be bizarre and cruel to me. You know, she would call me a mistake. And that was very confusing because, you know, as a child, your mum, you know, it's topsy-turvy. You don't know what's going on with your mum. And so I needed to know, once the wall collapsed, effectively, you know, 2013, I needed to know why did she cry uncontrollably while we waited for the school bus? And why did she gaze into space sitting on the couch? And why couldn't she get out of bed? And so, I'm getting emotional now, but I needed to know the truth about her. And I embarked on this investigation into her, and at that time I was working for Lateline, and I used my investigative skills to on my family to ask the hard questions and to you know, find out the truth about what happened to her. And your question was, what did was the outcome? Because I started with pretty much nothing. All I had was my recollections, which were hazy and nauseating. You know, the feelings of embarrassment came up again about Mum and her illness. So I had those, and they were all disjointed and kind of in a jumble. We had lots of family photos because Dad was an amateur and is an amateur photographer. He's crazy about taking photos. And so we had that. I had that to kind of draw upon to trigger recollections. But I knew that from working with Lateline, you needed documentation. You needed hard evidence, letters or documents in black and white. And so I started with the memories. I started interviewing Dad, and it was really luck, because, you know, when you start an investigation, you don't know what you've got, because when you start a story, as you would know, you just have an idea. It's like a kernel. You know, you don't even, you know, you start out in a story and you go, you don't know where it's going to go. It might not go anywhere. And a lot of times stories fall over, as you'll know. So when I started this, again, it was a kind of a mystery. But I think the big break at the start was actually securing her medical records, and that's what I set out to find. And when I was a kid, I used to go with Mum, you know, jump on the bus and we'd go to the psychiatrist. Now that's not normal for kids to kind of go with their mum to the doctor, but that's what I did. Jump on the bus. On the way back, we'd stop by for a cream bun. So, you know, normal childhood. And I knew the doctor, Dr. Chong, and I remembered him. And so the first point was to actually just try and track him down. Did a bit of Googling. The Dr. Chong came up, you know, that particular person came up, but it was an address that I didn't remember. And Dr. Chong is kind of a very common name as well. So how could I know? So I had to do a bit more digging, and Dad brought out an old address book, and the same address corresponded with the Google search. And I tracked him down and called him up, and he did remember Mum. And we had a bit of toing and froing trying to find these records. So I said to him, you know, do you have them? And he had them. He had these records from more than 20 odd years ago, from the 1970s and the 80s, these records, and he had them. Isn't that remarkable? That's really unusual in an investigation to have the records. So I set about going to get that, and then he sent them to me, so we had the records. And then the other thing I remembered was Mum's letter writing to my half-sister. Just to explain, my half-sister, lives in Malaysia. She's 10 years older than me. She's Muslim. I grew up as Catholic. We didn't grow up together. So I grew up as an only child in Melbourne, and she grew up in Kuala Lumpur. But I asked her, well, do you have these letters? And she said, of course I have them. Of course she had the letters. She had them somewhere, but she kept them. So she kept these letters that were from the 1980s and 1990s. It's a time capsule. And in the process of this investigation, I went to Malaysia to see her and retrieve these letters to find out what was inside them.
Now, you were saying earlier you used your journalistic investigative skills in terms of your family, but as you know, in your day job, you're telling someone else's story. How hard was it to tell your own story? I mean, you've got a conflict of interest there, haven't you? Because you're the person who wrote the story. Yeah,
it's about closeness, isn't it? And about how much you can distance yourself from the content. Because I'm writing a story, but I'm also writing my own story, and I have a vested interest. And there's an emotional connection as well. How can I write about Mum without being, having all the emotions sort of swirling around and be objective? But as journalists, as you know, I call it journalistic armor, because we deal with some really shitty stuff. We go into really dark places. And in my career, that's, I've ventured into dark places. When you're reading these court documents, or you're reading inquiry, the findings of an inquiry, and you have to trawl through that, and you have to remain divorced from it. So in the same way, I was able to put that emotional or journalistic armor up and read these documents impassively and as an observer. Obviously, that doesn't always work, because I'm human and I'm also Mum's son. And so you do have an emotional reaction. You can't be an objective viewer. You can't just sit and read Mum's old letters, hearing her voice again, and not be affected by that. But you do at the same time, because you've got a job to tell the truth. And yeah, that's our job. It's like we're supposed to tell the truth, and so that you've got to just face up to it. But you also, whatever the feelings.
But you've also got an ongoing relationship with people you're writing about.
Yeah, exactly.
What did your dad think about the book?
Dad was actually a surprisingly cooperative witness, as I say in the book, in my inquiry. He was actually, this is the investigation in 2015 was the first time that me and Dad had actually spoken about what happened to Mum. Can you imagine, Dad and his son not even talking about this for decades? And that was the thing, because after Mum died, I was the one who wanted to talk about it. I was the one who would go to Dad, I want to talk about Mum. But he would always just shut me down with the grunt. So I had to keep it to myself, and you just hold it inside yourself. What was your question? What did my dad?
Yes.
Yeah. So, but look, in the end, he was really enthusiastic. After a while, because I did interviews with him, and then when the book sort of came to fruition, and I was doing the manuscript, he was doing the fact checking. And he was going, and we need to put this in, and we need to remember that I raised this money for the refugees, and then I did this and I did that, and so he was like, he was like, put this in and put that in, and I was like, this is my story, Dad. And then he was also saying, I'm going to translate it into Khmer, and I'm like, Dad, you don't even have the rights. You're going to ask me to translate it. So anyway,
you were saying how you applied the blowtorch to your family, but then you pulled back a bit and said, in a gentle sort of way. You do poke gentle fun at your dad. The one thing that really made me laugh was how, as a teenager, you wanted to go to a deep forest concert.
Oh, yes.
And your dad thought that was the sign that you completely lost control. You're a wild.
Yeah. Who else was a fan of deep forest? Does anyone? Oh, I told you. See, so I'm not alone. The deep forest was it was a really lovely, and they're still around, really lovely new agey band who actually stole. They actually got in trouble much later on. They stole ethnic audio excerpts and then made heaps of money out of it by making amazing music. And I was a huge fan of them, and they were in Melbourne for the first time in 1996. And I was 15, 16 years old, my first gig. And me and my dad always clashed. We were different personalities, and I was going to go, and he just said, "You're not going." And I was not having any of it. I was not, this is my first gig. I saved up $50 for the ticket, a whole $50 for the ticket. And, I was definitely going to go. And so I had to try and work out, because we lived in the outer suburbs, it was going to cost me a bomb to try and get into town on a taxi. So I just called up my Cambodian cousin, Bin, who was also a bit of a rebel and on Dad's bad side. And she came pick me up in her bomb and went to the concert, and it was amazing. But afterwards, on the way back, we were actually involved in a car crash. And it's a great chapter. You should read that. It's hilarious. It is hilarious. But we were involved in it. Yeah. So not only did I disobey my dad by like leaving the house and going to a concert, we were involved in a car crash. Not my cousin's fault, but we were rear-ended, and we ended up in the cop shop, in the Oakley cop shop, and the cop obviously had to call my dad. And my dad was, he was apoplectic, to say the least. And he sort of fronted up. He couldn't even he wouldn't even come into the police station. He just would not, because I saw him in the window and he would not come in. It was almost like mice. I was just sitting on a plastic chair. And so anyway, I popped out. He didn't say anything. Popped into the passenger chair. But the only thing that he said to me was shame. And that's it. That's all he said to me. And I felt really alone at that very moment, because I thought, why did Dad react that way? It was a car crash. And this is the thing about my dad, is that he has his own way. But that was if you read it, it's actually really, really funny. But to my dad, I had disobeyed him of the highest order. I disagreed with him, went to the concert, and I was involved in a car crash. But there are levels of Asian shame, though. It is a very Asian thing, because it's shameful for his son to be involved in a car crash. It's shameful. But actually, I think and I said to him, the proper response is actually to say, "Are you all right? Are you okay?" Because we weren't injured, but the whole boot was total. It was a pretty bad accident. Petrol was on the road and everything. So
I also found that though some of the cross-cultural experiences quite moving. You paint a picture of how at home you had, I think, chops and mashed potato, yes, and you went to your cousin's place and had this extraordinary Khmer food.
Yes.
Your cousins went to Khmer school.
That's
and
right.
They were jealous of you because you went to a normal school.
Yeah.
But then, you sort of felt, you write about it quite a lot, of how you can't speak Khmer. I don't know if you like some more now, but that seems to, it sounds like it's a part of a Khmer identity that you felt that you didn't have a chance to explore when you were younger.
Yeah, well, look, when you're growing up, and I think this is quite common for Australians with migrant parents, is that there's a tension between what your parents want and what the wider society expects of you. And to fit in to a degree, and this differs for everyone, but to a degree, speaking for myself, I pushed it away. I rejected my Asian heritage, specifically my Cambodian heritage, because you know, mum's family were Eurasian, so they were more Western in that sense. But the Cambodian side spoke Khmer fluently. They ate these wondrous, strange soups and Khmer food, and which was very strange to me because, you know, in our household we did eat chops and mashed potatoes, and along with mum's Malaysian recipes. And it was, you know, it was a mixed up family, you know. And so with my Cambodian cousins, they were very Cambodian compared to me. And I had all these exemptions, cultural exemptions that Dad gave me, like not having to take off my shoes when I went to Cambodian households, or not going to Cambodian school and learning Khmer, not having a nickname like my cousins, because as he explained, he said, "You are mixed," and he treated me. It's a bit of a contradiction because he expected me to be Cambodian, the obedient Asian son, but then he was also giving me these exemptions. So how can you expect me to be, you know, fully Cambodian when you're kind of like quite loose in terms of the rules?
Well, Jason, it's a really powerful story and it's beautifully told. And obviously your storytelling that you use in your day job you've used on the page. It's a wonderful story, but I think we're about 7 o'clock. We'll finish it up.
Oh yeah, we can go on. any
Yeah, so well, I don't know what the process is. Do we?
Well, we'll go for questions actually, and also if anyone on Zoom has any questions, make sure you type them into the chat function, and they'll get sent to me on my phone. But anyone here have any questions for Jason? Yes.
Thank you, Jason. That cover is delightful on so many levels.
Yeah.
I haven't read the book, but can you explain the dandelions? Is that what they are?
The dandelions, yeah. So the question was about the cover.
Yeah.
This is a photo of me at 3 years old, and it's super cute. I have to say. My favourite red and white t-shirt. Dad took this photo in our front yard, and when I spoke to ABC Books HarperCollins, you know, we were looking at different covers, and I nominated this photo because it's a standout photo, which kind of sums up everything about being mixed up and being Australian at the same time. But I also wanted a floral motif, and they came up with this beautiful dandelion motif, and it's actually gloss. So the rest of it is matte and it's gloss, and you've got that nice feeling there. But the dandelions have a particular meaning in the story. It's symbolic of something that my mum said on her first date with Dad. Yeah, because Dad and Mum met in Melbourne on the streets of Flinders, on the steps of Flinders Street Station on a blind date, because Dad had put out this advertisement in a Melbourne newspaper seeking, you know, love and, you know, potentially a wife. And my mum responded to it, and they went on their first date. And the dandelions are kind of critical in that, in their first meeting. Yeah.
Any other questions from the audience? Yeah.
Yeah. On completing your book, how did you feel? Like, did you have a sense of completion yourself, a sense of relief, or did it ask you more questions?
I think there are still a lot of unanswered questions in the book, and I'm still very curious about how my relatives are going to react to it. I mean, my auntie Madeline in the book has reacted to it, and she said that this was, you know, going to be a healing process, and I do agree with her. She's a bit hippy dippy, but as we'll discover in the book. But I do agree with her that there is a sense of, I think what this book has been really enlightening and transformative for me, because the process was about redefining the past, about replacing bad memories with good ones. And trying to really salvage and rediscover Mum's love for me. Yeah.
I'm really keen to ask you about those records that you got from the doctor, because you know, normally like what are the legal kind of wranglings that you have to do? I know that your mother wasn't there to kind of give permission or not, but how did you manage to kind of obtain permissions?
It was actually really straightforward. I mean, these documents are actually there's like a cut-off. So after a number of years, they're actually supposed to be destroyed. I think in Victoria, I think they're supposed to be destroyed. So I'm glad that the doctor did not destroy them. But it was actually really straightforward, and Dr. Chong was really willing to hand them over. And so it was a matter of just writing to him and then getting Dad as the executor to release them, and then he just was very happy to give them to me.
Oh,
I mean, it's quite a risky thing, I guess. I mean, he was very relaxed about it because you don't know what's in them.
no.
And there is a big surprise in there as well, in the medical records. That's a big revelation for both me and my dad. You know?
And for everyone who reads
Yeah.
the book.
You'll have to read the book.
You have to go home now.
Yeah, absolutely, please.
I think, was it Maureen? Did you have a question? Yeah.
I was interested in what you had to say as a journalist and the way that you put objectivity and truth on one side and
Yes.
emotion on another. And I wondered about when you're writing memoir, whether emotion and truth are much closer together than objectivity.
That's such a good question. It's one of the smartest
Hard
people.
question, right?
Yeah, I tend to think it's separate though. I tend to think that you can separate your emotions from the truth, because you know, I might feel something about Mum, but it's not necessarily true. So the documents and the investigation actually kind of myth busted a few. Well, it totally redefined my mum, because I had a particular view about her. You know, I was embarrassed and ashamed of her, and they were the memories that I took with me into adulthood. But then the documents and knowing her pain and the catastrophic event that she experienced before she came to Australia made everything make sense. And so that was really clarifying. So it actually changed my emotions. It completely got rid of the bad ones. So that's objectivity, to kind of the black and white of a document to say this is what happened. And I guess you have a choice about, do you accept what happened as it happened, or do you then put your own spin on it and go, oh nah, you know, that's my belief. It's that, you know, because you could reject it. You could reject it, but I when you have documents, you know, it's hard to reject.
I suppose another one of the, because there's quite a few memoirists in the room tonight, I've noticed. Another thing is that you, as the writer of this book, your emotions are the truth of the book as well. So they might not be your link to your mother's truth, but they are certainly your own truth.
Well, I have to, you know, particularly writing about my grandmother was really, actually there's a few, you know, there's a whole bunch of relatives in this who were really difficult to write about. Two people in particular, my grandmother and my sister's father, because it was real tightrope, because I'm writing about my sister's father. I mean, I'm not related to him, so how can I write freely about him? And he was alive at the time of the writing, but then he died at the time of publication. So that kind of changed things. But I had to make a choice at one point where I added stuff to the manuscript while it was being edited about my position on him. Because I was, after finding out about what happened to Mum, I was bloody angry, you know, I was furious. And it's funny feeling furious for an event that happened ages ago. How can you feel? I still felt furious. And I tried to approach him, and I was thinking, if I speak to him, I'm going to lose the plot. You know, am I just going to like, just use so-and-so, you know? But again, I think I still would have been given him right reply. But at the same time, I realized, you know what, this fella doesn't need a right reply. He doesn't deserve a right reply. And I had to take a position. But that's what you'll find out when you read about
Right, we'll hide some.
the ex-husband, my sister's dad. Yeah.
Jason,
how long did it take you to write the book from the time that you decided that you were going to do it to the time it was accepted by the publisher?
Yeah, it took a very long time. So basically the writing started in, the investigation, like the interviews with family started in 2014. That's when I started searching for medical records and started interviewing. So but the proper writing was 2015. That's when I started writing a manuscript. So that's 6 years. And the other thing is that the original manuscript was incomplete because I'd written the mum story and completely ignored the sexuality aspect. But then other things had to happen for this book to come to fruition, which was the dad story in 2017, because it wasn't finished. It wasn't a finished story. All of that had to happen. And there were other events that happened after that as well that needed to be in the book. But I found it really hard to get published because I was hitting up publishers after the dad story, and Lee Sales, who I work with, my colleague, I don't want to name drop, but she was saying, she said to me, I'm surprised that publishers didn't approach you to write the book, but none did. And I was knocking on the doors, and it wasn't until, because I was engaged with a very well-known publisher who will remain unnamed, and they pretty much ghosted me because I was toing and froing with them for about a year, and then they ghosted me. And then I was sort of really heartbroken and was ringing around searching for advice, and someone said, "Oh, we'll contact this agent," and it was my agent who opened all those doors for me to then have and three publishers bid for it in the end. So I think I was kind of
getting that agent.
It was the agent. Yeah. I mean, doing it by myself was, sending emails to people, would they answer the email? It was the agent who opened the door. And so, as I like my publicist here, so I should say, but it is
it's all going back recording.
Yeah, exactly. It is ABC Books and HarperCollins who then saw the worth in the story, and that's really important, I think, for any writer, but particularly Asian Australian writers, because we're trying to bang on the door and we're trying to get in there, and it's really important that publishers actually go, there is a story in this because it's part of our national conversation and it's part of our nation. So I think it's great that ABC Books and HarperCollins got on board in the end, because it would not have happened. And so it's been really touching hearing from people, and people are starting to email me and starting to get that feedback, and it's only been a couple of weeks.
Right.
So, I love that feedback because working for 730, it's guaranteed that between 500,000 up to 1 million people will see my story and hear my name, but the book is a much smaller audience. But it's more intimate in the sense that you get this, people, I read your book and I think this and this and this, whereas your story is kind of on air for a few minutes and then it's gone. Yeah.
Question, yes. Thanks. Were there times when you were writing this book that you found it difficult to keep going, doing a dark and slow moment?
I just had to keep plowing through. I mean, because I was committed to Mum's story. That was very clear in my mind that I had to keep writing for her. There wasn't a moment where I was not, weeping over the keyboard, writing this story. The toughest aspect was the prologue. I don't know whether you've read the prologue, because the prologue was actually published in the Good Weekend a few weeks ago. That was probably the toughest because it opens with me finding Mum collapsed in the bed at 12 years old. And so I had my memories were very clear about that. But I also, when I was about 17 or 18, I'd written this email to a friend, basically putting everything down. This is what happened. This is how I feel. I feel guilty. I feel a sense of hopelessness because I can't save her. And I got no reply to that email, but because you're writing to a teenage friend, and teenagers, how could I process that, let alone my friends? But I had printed off that email this is probably off an Apple Mac from the 1990s, and I printed it off. For some reason, I thought at the time, I need to save this, and I printed it off and I saved it. I don't know why, but I just thought, for posterity, I needed to have this. And so in the process of writing that, I did go back to that. Probably shouldn't have gone and opened it because I sort of had to lie down. But I needed to see that as well because being the journalist, I wanted to fact check it, be accurate. I'm a bit anal, and so I needed to go, this is, and okay, I was, reading it back, I was like, yeah, that's spot on. That's how it was. My recollection's spot on. And Dad also says about the book when he was reading the manuscript. He's a man of few words. I don't get much out of him, but he said it is very vivid. It takes me back, and that's all I got from him. He hasn't said anything further, but I knew that when he said that I had accurately portrayed our story and our lives.
Question there. Yes.
Does your relationship with your dad change through the course of reading, writing, and researching the book? And do you think your dad feels that change as well?
It's hard to know what my dad thinks.
Yeah.
But but I think that so this was really enlightening for me because I got to know my dad better. It wasn't just this man who couldn't speak English, when I was growing up. I get to find out, the hardships that he carried in terms of caring for Mum, but also the big global events that affected my Cambodian family. The Khmer genocide. Dad was, during that time, was cocooned in Australia. He was very lucky because he was an international student and he was here. But that was his pain. His pain was being cocooned here in a very cozy life, and then watching his country burn to the ground and not knowing whether his brother or his sisters or his nephews and nieces were alive. And so that gave me a greater appreciation for Dad because, and a greater appreciation for my heritage, because then I thought, bloody hell, they've been through so much, and I feel a real.
It's an emotional story.
It is. I feel a great sense of pride now for my family.
I wonder whether the fact that there's a language barrier protects you a little bit from some of the other things that you might have to think about in terms of extended family and that with your writing. Is that?
I thought about this. That was a question that I thought about because the question is, would I feel closer to my relatives if I spoke Khmer, and would they then suddenly share, be able to share things with me in Khmer? And I actually think no, because even in Khmer, I don't think they would tell me. I do think that it would give me a level of closeness if I could converse with my dad in Khmer, but I don't think he would suddenly open up and tell me, how he felt about it. Because even in the book, I said, well, because you want to grab, you're trying to get a quote from him. Okay, I was trying to get a quote from my dad about genocide. I said, Dad, well, how did you feel? How did you feel that, how did you feel? And he couldn't bring it out. But, he just said, because my dad's quite literal, and he said, well, I thought they were all dead. And that was the quote, that's the quote, and that's all I'm going to get. There's no real unpacking or kind of, opening it. It's because it's the pain, I think. It's the pain of.
But does the fact that extended family can't read this because it's in English, does that protect you a little bit from some of the implications that might happen? Yeah, you can say anything and they can't.
Well, I do say anything. I mean, look, some of the aunties, so they're just so happy that the book is out and they're asking me for free copies, and they love the picture, and they love being in the center there as well. There's a beautiful photo from last year actually of my Cambodian aunties at the bottom there. Like if you've got a copy, you should go have a look. There's like my aunties, and they just rocked up to the photo shoot because they wanted to be in the photo, and they also wanted to be in a book as well. So.
Excellent. Are there any other questions from the audience here? I'll just double check that Zoom hasn't asked me anything to this computer
Seems like
directly.
it's still going.
No, I think that the Zoom people have
Any
finished
questions from
too.
Zoom? Oh,
No, so I think if there are no more questions from the room, we might call it a night and go to the more intimate discussion at the signing table. Look, it's been an absolutely fabulous time tonight, and thank you for sharing, and thank you very much for doing the conversation. It was it has been really illuminating, and I know that there are a lot of people in the room who are very interested in family story as well. So I think that maybe there's a chance to talk a little bit more about the process as we sit at the table.
yeah, wonderful.
Thanks very much.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.
What we're going to do is we're going to get Jason to his table before we all go out, so that it makes this area a little bit easier to get to. So
and can I also take a very quick selfie as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, before anyone moves, we're going to do a.
A really good turnout. I didn't know I had this much support in Queensland, so it's very nice.
Oh, okay. So,
There's a seat over. Well, come back here.